My name is Maeve and I'm the CEO of the Rutland Centre. We are an addiction treatment charity based in South Dublin, and we've been providing residential addiction treatment for the last 40 years. Now I know with your backgrounds there's probably people here who have some lived experience of addiction, maybe in a wider family or social circle. Some people might have a background in psychotherapy or have done some training in the field of counselling. And obviously you're all HR experts, so when we get to the HR section later on, don't judge me too harshly. I know this time of day as well, right after lunch, is a fantastic slot. It's a heavy enough subject, so hopefully I won't send too many of you off snoozing over the next half an hour or so. What is addiction? I suppose over the years, the topic of addiction and what it is has been hotly debated amongst all the experts in the field and all the people that have done research and have worked in the area. The one thing that isn't up for debate is the impact that addiction has on society, on families and on workplaces. So what I hope to do today is just try and go through the topic step by step, some of the characteristics of addiction, hopefully give a little bit of information without getting too technical. And myself and Danielle, my colleague, are around if afterwards anybody has any questions or has any specific situations in work that you're dealing with and would like some advice on what to do or where to go. So what I intend to cover today is what is addiction, the types of addiction, how to recognise it, the impact in the workplace, supporting someone in addiction, and what services are available to people. I also know from experience that whenever we do these talks, this can sometimes raise sensitive or emotional issues for people who have some lived experience, who have some family experience. We don't often get a lot of questions afterwards, I'll be honest with you. People tend to take the info and give us a shout in the weeks or months afterwards even. So our contact details will be at the end, and if over the course of the next few weeks or months there's anything we can do for you, please don't hesitate to get in contact at any time. So there's a lot of debate, as I said, as to what addiction is or isn't, and whether it's a disease or whether it's some kind of a moral or spiritual failing, just a simple selfish pursuit of pleasure without concern about the consequences or concern about anybody else. Thankfully, in recent years, advances in brain imagery have really helped us understand addiction, and the American Society of Addiction Medicine offers this comprehensive definition. I'm not even going to try and read that out to you guys. You can read it yourselves, and would you believe that's the shortened version? The actual full definition is about 10 times longer than that. But what that definition does is it captures the complexity of what addiction involves. So when we're assessing whether a person has an addiction or not, it's not just a case of looking at whether they are or aren't using substances or how much they're using, but actually assessing how they're using affects their daily functioning and how it impacts on the people around them. And it's characterised by 5 characteristics, which I'm going to explain over the course of the next number of slides. And they're captured in that definition: the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioural control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems, and a dysfunctional emotion response. A key element to any addiction are negative consequences. A person continues to engage in behaviour despite the consequences, and that can be really hard for others to understand, really hard for loved ones or for colleagues to understand. Why would someone do this to themselves? So hopefully we'll work through that and give people a better understanding. The one thing to say about addiction is it's a chronic illness, and like other chronic illnesses, it involves cycles of relapse and remission, and without treatment or engagement in recovery activities or recovery programs, it's progressive and can result in serious illness and even death. Okay, that's the real heavy bit out. So what we look at, or what we assess at the Rutland Centre, are the ABCs of addiction. So the first one is the inability to abstain from a substance or a behaviour. But the key bit here is the consistency bit. So we probably all know people who tell us that they've no problem giving up alcohol. We see Dry January and all these different types of initiatives. And that just backs up the assertion for the person that they don't really have a problem. But actually, for someone in addiction, it's the staying stopped. So most people in addiction will be able to sustain a short period of being stopped. It's the staying stopped is the problem. And it's the once they get started again is where the real impact kicks in, and that's the real problem for family members and for colleagues. As Mark Twain said, giving up smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I know because I've done it thousands of times, and that's applicable for anybody in addiction. And like I said, the problem for a person is not necessarily stopping, but what happens when they start again. The AA slogan is, one drink is too many and 1,000 drinks is never enough. And that really captures what addiction and relapse is all about. The B is the impairment in behavioural control. So addiction is a progressive disease, and if it's not treated, it continues to get worse. And a person in addiction will cross behavioural lines that they never saw themselves crossing in the past. They'll do things they never thought themselves capable of doing when they weren't in addiction. And we see their rules around their behaviours changing. So where someone might have said once, oh, I don't drink on a weeknight, or I don't drink before 7, or I don't drive when I drink. As a person progresses in their illness, those rules change over time and they cross lines that they never saw themselves crossing before. And that can be equally visible in the workplace. So it could be cutting corners if they're driving for work, maybe having taken a drink, or even a cavalier approach towards coming in at all, or time and attendance, and that's something that an employer might be seeing a pattern emerging in. It can also lead to brushes in the law. It can lead people to engage in activities such as theft, and apologies now, I'm after going wrong here. Sorry now. Okay. Or stealing from an employer, and that's something that we do come across on a regular basis in the Rutland Centre. Several research studies, including MRI scans of brains and studies on animals, have shown that the brain activity of people who are addicted to substances is very similar to that of people who have had sustained traumatic damage to the brain, the prefrontal cortex to be specific. And people who have damage to this part of the brain generally suffer impaired judgment. They have poor money management strategies, and they tend to act impulsively, and they're behaviours that you might see play out in the workplace. What this means for people in addiction is that they're unable to appropriately weigh up the pros and cons of a decision. So they're not making informed decisions the way people who aren't in addiction are doing so. And again, that can be hard for people to put together. Why is this person acting this way? What's causing them to make these decisions? What they're focused on is the short-term option, what's going to give them the best relief and the quickest form of relief, not the long-term, what's best for me in the long term, what's best for my family in the long term. They will consistently prioritise their substance or their behaviour over any other core values: family, leisure activities, friendships, work commitments, hobbies. Their brains just aren't focused on the long-term consequences of their choices. The third C in the ABCs is craving. And again, research has shown that cravings are due to overactivity of specific parts of the brain, and that people who have used substances, even for a relatively short period of time, are less responsive to natural rewards, such as interpersonal relationships, hobbies, motivation at work. And actually, this applies not just to substances, but to behaviours as well. So gambling, sex, shopping, food, they all activate the same part of the brain. Okay. So essentially, we can become addicted to anything that is mood altering, anything that activates the dopamine receptors in our brain, anything that offers a reward, and that alters the mood for people. So engaging in any substance or behaviour that we associate with reward floods the brain with dopamine. Okay, it takes dopamine levels up to as much as 5 or 10 times the normal level, and when these levels are elevated, the user's brain starts to think that these are your natural levels. So what happens is the person needs more and more dopamine to sustain that high that they're getting. And again, then that moves them further away from their normal behaviours and further down the progressive addiction path. And the cravings that they get then is as they're using more and as they need more and more dopamine, their physical tolerance to the substance or the behaviour grows, so they're on this constant trajectory where they need more and more, and their brain has forgotten what a natural reward is and what the natural levels of dopamine are. Okay, the person becomes totally preoccupied with the substance or behaviour, and all they're consumed about is how they're going to get it, when they're going to get it. And what you might see in a workplace is, for example, somebody getting angry that they're not out at 5 o'clock on the dot because they have a plan. They know where they want to be, and their priority is about getting there. That's just one example, but it's something that we would hear regularly when people come in for treatment. Another characteristic of addiction is the D, which is the diminished recognition of problems. A much easier way of saying that is denial. So when we talk about denial in addiction, that's the part where they do not see the consequence of their behaviour, do not see the impact that it's having on anybody else. It isn't a conscious or willful behaviour, it's actually a psychological defence that's formed to protect the person from experiencing that core sense of shame that accompanies addiction so often. And as the addiction progresses, it gets very quickly long past the point where anybody's actually enjoying themselves, where there's any real reward coming from the addiction. They're in this cycle of shame and self-loathing, and that's a really distressing and difficult place for a person to be. And they move from, gradually, but they do move from seeing themselves as someone who occasionally behaves badly to somebody who is intrinsically bad. And that's a really difficult place for a person to be. So I suppose our message would be, if there is somebody in addiction, try and put yourself in their shoes. This is where they're at. They're not out having a great time. This isn't a wonderful experience. This is a really, really distressing experience for them. And they only have one strategy to cope with this pain, and that's to take more, or to gamble more, or to shop more, to whatever their behaviour or substance of choice is. They will inevitably use substances or behaviours to get that feeling away, to numb it out, so whether it's eating or shopping, and they will use any manner of defences to justify it. So it could be, my job is too boring, my job is too stressful, I don't have a problem, you have a problem, and you're nagging me, sure, why wouldn't I drink? And there'll be 1,000 different ways that they'll try and minimise it and justify it and rationalise it. And that is actually the denial, that diminished recognition of the consequences of their own problems that's playing out in front of you. It also typically means, this denial, that the person in addiction, and this is really where families find it difficult particularly, is that the person in addiction is the last person to see that there's a problem. So everyone else around them can see what's going on, everyone else around them is feeling the impact, and it's really hard to get a message through because their brain just isn't registering it. Their brain doesn't know what they're doing is wrong. It has hidden it so deeply and created pathways in the brain to avoid it so strongly that it can be really difficult to make that move and to make that breakthrough with a person. And addiction it's unique amongst all the chronic illnesses insofar as it's the only one where the brain actually tells the sufferer that you don't have a problem. So the brain actually sends a message to say, you don't have a problem, everyone else has the problem. And that's a really difficult place, whether you're an employer, a HR leader, somebody charged with fixing this issue in work, or a family member or a loved one or a friend. That's a really difficult space to be in at that critical point. The final characteristic is the dysfunctional emotional response. There's a really strong link, and evidence is coming out every month, every year, to show that there's a really strong link between addiction and trauma. So we know from the Rutland Centre that probably up in the 90% of people that come in for treatment have had some childhood trauma in their past. And that could be anything from poverty, neglectful parenting, emotional abuse, right up to the big T's of the sexual abuse, violence, death, that type of thing. But there's a really strong link there. And what happens is people turn to substances or addictive behaviours because they haven't developed the emotional maturity to deal with what happened to them in their childhood, or they develop these strategies when they're young and they just continue to play out into their adult lives. And this is how they manage their feelings. It provides short-term relief from their emotions, but this avoidance over time will lead to far bigger problems for the person and their family. When difficult emotions are drowned down with alcohol or numbed out with drugs or gambling or stuffed down with food, there isn't any opportunity to feel and process emotion, and it's that avoidance that really feeds the addiction. People who use substances or behaviours to cope with everyday life tend to feel overwhelmed by the normal problems that the rest of us would be able to take in our stride or to manage with healthier stress management techniques. And because they're disconnected from themselves emotionally, they struggle to connect with anybody else emotionally, or maybe they move away from relationships that they had more towards isolation because that's how they manage this, these unwanted emotions that they just don't know how to. They don't have strategies on how to deal with it. They take refuge in isolation. They believe that the world is unsafe and that other people are threatening them. And how that plays out and how you might see that play out is the one common emotion that you'll see in addiction is anger. So people will lash out if they're confronted or if they feel unsafe or they feel threatened. And again, that might be something that you'd see in a workplace. When you try to make an approach, you might get an immediate backlash before somebody might take a step back and really ask themselves, is there a legitimate question there? And one of the core tasks of recovery and treatment is actually reconnecting with emotions and helping people develop strategies for managing their emotions. So, for example, when people come into us for treatment, we would do a lot of work on anger management and pieces like that, so that people have the tools after treatment when something challenging or stressful comes at them in everyday life, that they know how to deal with it and how to cope with it without reverting or turning to the substance or behaviour. And it's about regulating and learning how to tolerate difficult feelings because they were a part of everyday life. Okay, so as I mentioned, we can become addicted to anything, not just substances. But without a doubt, on our experience in the Rutland Centre, in Ireland, our biggest addiction risk by far is alcohol. So it's the drug that kills 3 times more people in this country than any other drug, than all the other drugs of abuse combined. But the process addictions, which are also known as behavioural addictions, they're just as real. And when you meet somebody who has a process or a behavioural addiction, the impact and the destruction is equally as bad as somebody who's taking a substance or drinking alcohol, but they're often easier to hide. So you'd often hear things like gambling is the silent addiction, or you might be shocked to learn that somebody has an eating disorder because they're not as obvious. There's a lot of secrecy around it, a lot of deception. And often it means that by the time you learn that there's a problem, it's actually gone way further than what you might have imagined because it's been hidden so well for so long. And there's no doubting that the increased access to social media, to the internet, to online gambling, to online sexual encounters, all of those things are feeding into the increased prevalence of process addictions. I know in the Rutland Centre, over 90% of people that come through the doors have an alcohol addiction. But now, about 70% of people that come in have more than one addiction. So it's alcohol plus. So it's alcohol plus gambling, alcohol plus sex or pornography or food. Some people, there could be 3 or 4 in the mix there, and it's becoming ever more complex to treat. The same with substances, illicit or illicit. People no longer take one drug. They come in and they're addicted to a myriad of drugs. So there's cocaine, there's cannabis, and everything's in the mix there. And that's really difficult because the impact on the brain and on people's physical bodies, it really takes a toll and it becomes very hard to treat. So how would you recognise it? First of all, before I get into a list of signs and symptoms, I just want to say addiction is never a choice. Nobody's ever wanted to be in addiction or to be called an addict. And as I said earlier, it really quickly gets past the point where anybody's having any fun or getting any enjoyment out of it. But it is a reality for a huge number of people. And we always say that we need to throw out our misconceptions about who comes into treatment or what type of person or family becomes addicted. So, for example, in the Rutland Centre, our typical client is age 42, 43, male, 3rd level educated, full-time employment, married, homeowner, has children, and they come from work and they progress back to work. And that's a little different from when we think of addiction. The easy option is to think, homeless person, sleeping on the street, drinking out of a bag or a brown bag or some such, or, using heroin or shooting up, and that'll never be us or that'll never be my community or family. We have seen and consistently see people from all walks of life, all types of professions, business owners, managers, leaders, people at all levels of organisations come in for treatment, teachers, guards, nurses. It's literally everywhere. So I suppose not to be surprised in your own organisation if it's something that rears its head or pops its head up. Research in America would suggest that 8 to 10% of the population will suffer from addiction at some point in their lives. That's quite high. So if you think about the number of people that you employ and take the 8% figure, it's probably likely that somebody themselves is struggling, or maybe has a loved one at home who's struggling, and the impact of that can be just as destructive on the workplace and on relationships as well. Because it's not just a person in addiction that suffers, their immediate family are all affected, and it's a really painful experience that can change a person's personality. Family members could be so preoccupied and become so codependent on their loved one's addiction that their own performance in the workplace is compromised. So you might be wondering what's up with this person and seeing patterns, and it mightn't be that they have an issue, but it could be that they're going home every evening and trying to contain something, or picking up the pieces of a really destructive behaviour at home. In a survey done in America a couple of years ago, family members of people in addiction reported that they themselves had attention difficulties in work, made mistakes, had accidents in the workplace, all as a consequence of their focus solely being on their loved one. So they find it really difficult to focus on their own lives and on their own work because they're so preoccupied. When is that guard going to come to the door? When am I going to get that phone call? What's happened to the money? Is the mortgage paid? And you can imagine yourself, that can be quite a cycle to be in. And equally, if you're working with someone in addiction, you can become preoccupied about their behaviour because maybe you're worried about your safety. Maybe if they're operating machinery or driving cars or dealing with the public or minding children, whatever the case may be, your focus then becomes on how do you mitigate that as opposed to your own performance. And that's where I suppose the HR function comes in. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So addiction in the workplace, just a couple of stats that I pulled there from the Alcohol Action Ireland website. They have a really good section. Now it is alcohol specific, but they have a really, really good section around the workplace that I'd recommend that you visit. There's loads of reports, loads of stats. They're constantly updating them. But it's really interesting just even to see the cost of alcohol-related harm in the Irish workplace, over €500 million. And that's a report, I think, from 2016. 330 million for absenteeism and 197 million from workplace accidents. So that's a huge cost to a workforce. So the impact is real. And I think as well, one of the top figures is 74% of substance abusers in Ireland are in full-time employment. Supports what I was saying earlier, that most people in addiction are they're holding it together in the workplace. Possibly not at home, but the workplace is the one place where they are holding it together. And we often see people come from work into treatment and transition back into work. But I would recommend, there's lots of research on that website, I'd recommend having a look at it. So how do you recognise addiction in the workplace, and what do you do if you see it? And this can be really hard because you're trying to piece together patterns. You're not necessarily qualified to make a diagnosis or to make an intervention. And also, people in addiction are generally really highly invested in maintaining their good standing in the workplace. And typically it's the last area that cracks begin to show. And there's a few reasons for this. The most obvious reason is that it's generally the primary source of income for most people in addiction. And if they don't have a job and they don't have income, they can't feed the addiction. And it's as simple as that for a lot of people. But another reason is that it protects the delusion that there isn't really a problem, and that goes back to the denial piece as well. So if they're holding down a job, getting in and out of work, and somebody at home approaches them and says, I think you're drinking too much, or I think you're gambling too much, going, no, I don't have a problem, sure, am I holding down my job, am I going to work every day? I wouldn't be able to do that if I had a problem. You're the one with the problem. And it feeds that denial piece all the time, and it keeps that cycle going. In our experience at the Rutland Centre, generally by the time addiction becomes apparent in the workplace, it's pretty far progressed and it's pretty entrenched. And we see that people, bombs will have been going off at home and in social circles for ages, but it's not until there's a crisis at work and the job is on the line that people will actually accept that they need to get help or they need to address the problem. So they can juggle all the different balls at home and keep things going and keep that denial and control going. But when it hits work and work becomes threatened, that's when they tend to seek help. The consequence becomes so big that they need to do something, and that's when they end up on our doorstep. So what should you look out for if you're either for a colleague, for your boss, or for an employee? Before I get into any list, what I would say is, unless we're clinically trained, and I'm not and Danielle's not, and I don't know how many people here might have a background in that, it's not your job to try and diagnose a problem or to make any kind of assessment, really. I suppose it's more about giving objective indicators that there might be a problem and knowing where to turn and where to send or signpost a person so that they get the help that they do need. And that's a really important part of how you'd get someone to transition into treatment. So, and these are workplace specific, these ones, things that you might see that might indicate there's a problem. Leave in attendance, unexplained or unauthorised absences from work, especially in the later stages of addiction where it's become unmanageable and where the preoccupation has become so overwhelming that it takes complete precedence over coming to work and doing the job. Excessive use of sick leave, patterns after payday or Mondays, Fridays, that type of thing. If you're seeing something repeat itself and play out over time, or frequent unexplained absences due to emergencies at home, things that crop up on a regular basis more so than they would for anybody else. Performance problems, missed deadlines, careless or sloppy work or faulty analysis, or minor accidents, making simple mistakes that they might never have done before, or putting their lives or the lives of anyone around them in danger. Relationships at work. When relationships become strained because colleagues become frustrated and the person themselves is also isolating and withdrawing any kind of connection with the people around them, that can be quite telling. They might become angry, belligerent, argumentative, especially in the mornings or after weekends or holidays, or if they can't get out on time, or if their timetable or their plans have been upset by having to work extra or something doesn't go to plan. That can be a bit disconcerting. And also financial problems. Addictions are expensive. Addictions need money. That's how you feed them. So if a company or an employee property is disappearing, it's possible, it's not always the case, but it's possible that somebody is taking it without authorisation to continue their habit. Or if they themselves are constantly struggling for money, constantly need to borrow money off people, get to payday and the next day it's gone. And we'd often hear stories from people that have come through our service, particularly who are gambling, that they get paid on the last Thursday of the month and by Friday it's all gone because they have punted it all on a sure thing, and then they spend the next, and there's one guy I'm thinking of, and he spent the next 4 weeks of every month not being able to buy lunch, having to walk to work because he couldn't get the bus, he had holes in his shoes, and holding it all together, you know, had the suit, had the title, had everything, but literally got paid the last day of the month and the next day it was all gone. So you might see things like that, or be able to put two and two together. Okay. Obviously, none of these things singularly can be taken as evidence of an addiction, and any of these things could indicate a myriad of other problems. But what they do is they give you a sense of a picture and maybe give you the impetus or the grounds to have a conversation, to have an objective conversation. Can you track them over time? Can you put facts together that can't be argued with, that are irrefutable? And we would suggest that's the way to go about it if you are about to approach an employee. Have some irrefutable facts, not a judgment around, we think you drink too much, or we think you're gambling too much, or we think there was a smell of drink off you on Monday morning. You're much more likely to get a better engagement, we think, from what we've seen with the people that come to us, if there are facts that can't be manipulated or facts that can't be got around with excuses. If you say you've missed the last 5 Mondays, or you've missed the last 5 Fridays, or this money is missing, or this job wasn't done, or this accident happened, they're facts that can't be necessarily argued with, and that's just around preparing for a conversation. Okay, I think I might have skipped a slide. I might just scoot back for a second, that's all right. There was another little list, I thought, yes, about recognising addiction. And I flew through that. These are just some signs, and these would apply to any addiction. Feel free to take a photo of it, or I can send it on to people if they like. Just if you're putting these together with the work performance pieces that we just talked about, the attendance and time and those bits and pieces. Again, none of these are singularly indicative of an addiction, but if you're starting to see a pattern play out and 3 or 4 or 5 of these boxes are being ticked on a regular basis, along with some of the other pieces around time and attendance or performance or accidents or attitude at work, then again it strengthens your case for bringing up a conversation or for approaching the subject. I won't read through them. Is that all right? Did people get what they needed there? Yeah? You okay? Yep. Okay. So what can you do in the workplace? First and foremost, I suppose we would say there's a 3-pronged approach that managers and leaders and business owners need to take. The first one is promoting health and safety for everybody. The second one is complying with safety legislation, and the third one is managing poor work performance. And in a room full of HR managers, I don't think I need to explain too much about the importance of any of these, and I'm sure you can teach us a bit more about it than we can you. But I think that these 3 things will underpin any type of approach that you're going to make to an employee. If you have your processes in place and you have information to hand, it'll support any approach that you're trying to make, or any intervention that you're planning, or that an EAP is planning, or anything like that. So part of this involves providing everybody with information about addiction, helping people to understand what addiction is and to recognise that it comes with risks. People, I suppose, from our point of view, we'd like everyone to understand that it's a disease that progressively gets worse, so it's not going to go away by ignoring it. Very rarely is somebody able to pull back from active addiction without some kind of intervention or treatment or counselling at the very least. And also, it's important that people know that you can recover. The brain does recover. So, yes, there are changes in the structure of the brain that get progressively worse throughout addiction, but they can be reversed in recovery. And we see good people go back to work all the time and get back into holding their jobs, get back into promotions, get back to 3rd level education. So it is possible, and that's a really important message for somebody and for families that are in active addiction, that it is possible to turn it around. It takes work and it's hard, but it can be done. The brain is a remarkable organ, and there's huge potential there for people to live lives, and we often hear people say that after treatment and in recovery they lived a life that was far more rewarding than they ever thought possible and that they ever had before they were in addiction. It's also important that everybody knows their obligations under the health and safety legislation. We've obviously all got a duty under the Health and Safety Act to protect the safety and welfare of employees, and that's around risk assessment and your safety statement. So if intoxicants can be a hazard at work, have you got a risk assessment? Do people know that it's there? What information have you communicated to people? And again, are people driving vehicles? Are they minding children? Are they in healthcare, operating heavy machinery, working alone, access to large amount of cash? If any of those things are there, and there's probably another 100 things that are there, it's really important that you've looked at it from that angle and that you have really robust processes in place. And that's to mitigate the risk for your organisation as much as for the person and for the people that work with the person in addiction as well, to make sure that there isn't an accident in the workplace and that somebody isn't really, really harmed. Because, if somebody arrives into work in a state of acute intoxication, they're really, really drunk, obviously you're going to take action. You're going to send them home. But if somebody arrives in and they're completely preoccupied by their addiction, so they're not necessarily under the influence now, but they might be really, really hungover, or they might be feeling the effects of a substance that they've taken, or they might just be singularly focused on getting out at 5 o'clock. That presents a risk too, because their focus isn't on the job at hand, and if they're in a safety critical role, that can be really important. So it's, again, really important that you build that into your processes. Okay, so what we would suggest is have a policy for dealing with intoxicants. I know there's a couple of courses out there that actually address how to structure your policy. Our experience at the Rutland is, and we would work with a lot of employers, they come to us, thanks Hannah, they come to us after an event. So they've had to deal with a situation, they've got through it, but realise then in hindsight, we actually should have something in place. So what we would encourage people is get in there first, have your processes, have your policies, so that if you do need to make an approach to an employee, that you have the backup and you know what you're doing and everybody is on the same page. And that the employee and colleagues around also know what to expect and what the boundaries are. That's really important. So have a policy, make sure everybody knows about it, make sure they know that it applies to them, not just to somebody else, because they would never be affected by addiction. Give them plenty of information. One of the key things is assure them of confidentiality. There is so much shame and stigma associated with addiction that people really, really struggle with coming forward and asking for help. And in the workplace, that's amplified. So people need to know that they can talk to you and that it's confidential and that it's safe, that it's not going to go around the office like wildfire, that people aren't going to see that somebody has been hauled in. It's really important, if you want to have any hope of helping someone access treatment or improve their work performance, that they know that it's a really safe conversation. But equally, you're quite entitled to have boundaries, to set expectations, to ask in return if you're going to help an employee. That's perfectly fine too, but the confidentiality piece is actually really important. We would say as well, have some information to hand around what services are out there, even if it's a flyer in the drawer in the HR office or a folder that has signposts to different services, be it PA to House, Samaritans, the AA meetings or the Al-Anon meetings, or services like ourselves or the HSE or GPs. Have something that you can give to people to take away and consider. It's really unlikely that you'll have a conversation with someone and the very first time you have a conversation they'll say, absolutely no problem, I'm going to go to treatment. This unfortunately would probably be drawn out over a period of time. So it's about arming them with information and building up a little bit of trust there so that they will know that they can ask for help. That can be difficult in a workplace if those behavioural lines have been crossed consistently. We regularly get people who have legal proceedings outstanding, or maybe have stolen from work, or maybe there's been an accident, and it's harder for the employer to really trust the person or the process. But without that trust there and without that relationship and that confidentiality, it's not going to work out for either side. And there is, and you probably are all aware of it, but I know in March 2006, I think it was, the Labour Court upheld the principle that alcoholism is a disability under the Employment Equality Act. So, you know, reasonable accommodation, what are you doing? It's the same as if someone came in with any other kind of disability. And it's reasonable to think that that would be extended beyond alcohol if it was challenged in court. So if somebody had a gambling addiction, a drug addiction, that the same finding would be made. And that's really important from an employer's point of view, to be aware that that exists. Okay. Sorry, I'm just saying, give information. The last thing that I would say just on that slide is about approaching the employee. Always that should be done in a safe, confidential, private setting. If you have an EAP service or occupational health service that you contract in, we would say ask them to sit in, have done your prep work, have your policies there, have your facts to hand, but have support there as well. Don't go into that meeting alone. You might experience a reaction that you're not expecting. It might impact on you. You need to protect yourself as well. You might hear something that you're not, somebody might disclose something to you that's really difficult to take, or they might express that they're feeling suicidal, or they might disclose some kind of a trauma. So it's about protecting yourself in that situation as well, and knowing where your role ends and where you need to pass somebody on to another service and where they can get the best help. And that's about having all that information to hand. I'm just going to fly through this, apologies now. There are loads of services out there that you can direct people to. We would always say the GP is a great port of call. The GP has a relationship with the family, a relationship with the person themselves, and can direct to different services. Obviously the HSE have a lot of different supports that you can find on their website, and there's lots of providers like ourselves out there who do inpatient and outpatient addiction treatment. So there are lots of options. It's just a matter of putting them together and giving them to people. If you were helping someone into treatment, we would just suggest that or if you're thinking about selecting a treatment provider, just consider some of these items so that you know that the person is getting the best treatment that they can. So some of that would be around the qualifications and experience of the team. Is it a residential programme? Are they accredited externally? What support do they give families? And do they have an aftercare programme? We know from experience people that go into aftercare after treatment have a much higher rate of recovery than people that don't. And they stay abstinent for longer than people that don't go into aftercare. And we would say that it's okay, and that kind of brings me onto this side, if you're, as an employer, helping someone into treatment, we would suggest that rehabilitation back into the workplace is a really key part. So they're not going to go to treatment and then come back and pick up where they left off. They're going to need ongoing support. You might need to tailor their duties or make adaptations in the workplace. But it's also okay to set some expectations on your side and, you know, have clear rules around, are they attending their aftercare? Are they going to their AA meetings? What are they doing to sustain their recovery? And we would suggest that that gets the person more invested and gets a little bit more buy-in, and would help them in their recovery as well, and also help them realise the impact that it's had on the workplace and how the workplace has supported them through their treatment. Okay. Just finish up a small little bit about the Rutland Centre. So we are a charity, as I said earlier on. We offer a 5-week residential programme or a 10-week outpatient programme. Entry into either of those programmes is based on a clinical assessment, so it isn't around what a person wants to do, because everyone's going to choose the outpatient. And some people just need inpatient treatment, especially if they've been in addiction for years or there's been a serious consequence at work. And then regardless of which programme you go into, everybody goes into a minimum of a year aftercare afterwards, and that's a weekly meeting plus one-to-one counselling, plus time with our consultant psychiatrist as and when needed, and plus 24-hour phone support. And like I said, that the people that do the aftercare and commit to the aftercare have a better outcome than the people that don't, the people that just go straight back and think it can just be picked up where they left off. So that's really important. When you come to treatment, I suppose we could talk all day about what it involves, but the main parts of treatment are group therapy, one-to-one counselling, education lectures around the emotional management, anger management, those kind of things, trauma. And we also do alternative therapies and family involvement as well. We're covered by all the major health insurers, so most people that come to us will pay through their health insurance, so they won't actually have to pay out any money. It covers, most plans actually have, I think it's 90 nights a year, or 90 nights in a 5-year period. For addiction treatment, our programme is 35 nights. And so that means that most people are covered automatically. We also work with a lot of employers who will fund access into treatment and recoup it from the employee when they make it back to work over the course of their early recovery. And we're happy to talk to anybody about that on a case-by-case basis over the course of the next few weeks or months if you need to. And we do have a limited number of fully funded HSE beds as well. That's called Tier 4 funding, and those beds are allocated by GPs and community health organisations. I think that's the nod for me. We treat adults only, so men and women from 18 years and up, and we regularly have people from 18 right up to age 70. The most common bracket is 30s, 40s and 50s, and it's about 65% male, 35% women that come in for treatment. And just to say, our team is led by a consultant psychiatrist, and then we have addiction counsellors, psychologists, psychotherapists, and nurses on hand as well. And obviously we're residential, so we're open 24/7. So that's us. The last message that I'd like to say, if that's okay, is, because all that's very heavy and it's very serious and can kind of come across negative sometimes, is we know that treatment works for people. People can recover. And every day, even today, we meet people who tell us, my dad or my uncle or my mum or my sister was in with you guys and it changed our lives. It really does work for people. It doesn't work for everybody, but it does work for a lot of people. And it is possible. So we would always advocate for the person in addiction. So what we'd be saying is, please don't write anybody off. Please, if you can help them, help get into treatment, because chances are they can recover, and they will recover if they have the right support and the right help was given to them when they need it. So just want to leave you on that positive, and that's my contact details if anybody would like to give us a shout afterwards. Sorry for the rush, Hannah. Thank you very much.